Wonderful. Okay. Um, Great. So I know some of you just from kind of I can recognize some names. So thank you for being here, and for those of you that I might not know, nice to meet all of you guys. My name is Maurice Pateski. I'm at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. I'm a veterinarian, poultry epidemiologist, and do some work with small farmers around California and beyond. You can see my email address below, so feel free to email me when you have questions. If for some reason I don't respond, feel free to ping me a couple times. So just like all of us, sometimes if I don't recognize a name or something like that. So I apologize in advance if that happens, but the whole point of this is to get to know each other. So here you can see, we're going to talk about this later, but this is, we did this almost like a decade ago. We had a UC Davis pasture poultry farm, and we've done some work since then. This was on layers. We've done some work since then on broilers, and we'll kind of incorporate some of the things that we've learned. But I think, as all of you guys know, the people that really understand the systems are the ones that are there every day on farms, small and medium and large. So feel free always to push back on anything I say if you think it's not practical or you have your own insights. With that, I'm very informal by nature, so feel free to ask questions, put them in the chat box, or just raise your hand, whatever, or chime in. Always willing to kind of answer questions and see what things are going on there. So our lab at UC Davis, we do a lot of mapping. So I just wanted to show you, because I think sometimes we think about these small and medium farms, and as a percentage of food production, it's actually relatively small in the U.S. But when you look at it as far as the number of small and medium farms, which has some criteria as defined by USDA, there's a lot of them, as you can see through this, whether it's poultry or swine or not as much dairy, but you can just see we have a lot of small and medium farmers in the U.S. There's a lot of need to help them, to work with them in all kinds of ways. And, one of the things, the way I'm kind of jaded or the way I look at, unfortunately, these kind of maps is I think about highly pathogenic avian influenza. And you can see, and I think you guys probably have seen this kind of stuff in the news, that this virus is also ubiquitous, unfortunately. So wherever we have farms, especially poultry and now dairy and potentially swine, we are worried about this kind of disease, and not just in the animals, but also in the workers themselves. It is an occupational risk and something we need to be aware of. I won't talk about it too much here, but all the stuff we're talking about, husbandry, biosecurity, those all affect our animals and ourselves. With that, I'll kind of move on. I usually don't put outlines, but this will be I just wanted to kind of give a rough sense of the kind of the direction we're going in. I'm going to sneak in just a little nutrition in there, but I think the most important thing, again, is just that we know each other here, and that as you have questions, I can try to answer them offline also. If you go to the UC Cooperative Extension Poultry website, there's extension labs and websites throughout the country. That's actually one of our kind of superpowers as a country. We have a really robust extension system. If I go to China or Vietnam or Indonesia or Africa, anywhere, there's going to be universities there just as good as our universities, and they do the same kind of research and things like that. For some reason, it's interesting. Our extension system is kind of still very unique in the world. Other countries have extension systems, but the whole idea of extension is for folks like me to do applied research and to work with people in farmers, like some of the people that are on the call, in order to kind of help them. It's just really kind of unique in that sense still that we have this. You can come onto our website, and we've got all kinds of resources there, and all kinds of material that could be helpful. in all kinds of different ways. Perhaps one of the more important things to look at is who to contact in case of poultry issues. So I work for University of California. You guys pay my salary. Thank you. So the least I could do is kind of put up resources of who you can reach out to when you have questions on diagnostics or on flock management or sick birds or ectoparasites or behavior. All of these things here, if you go on to who to contact, which is on this little dashboard at the top or ribbon at the top of the website, there's emails and in some cases phone numbers for who you need to contact regarding all those type of questions. So take advantage of that. That's what this is for. And if you can't get a hold of someone, as always, feel free to reach out to me. A couple other things I wanted to point out. So I have what's called a link tree. So this is the website down here for the link tree. And this is another way of just looking at all the resources that we have. That you can, if you click on my link tree, you'll see this, and you'll see, recent podcasts and maybe some recent articles and a survey that the CDC asked us to kind of push out to backyard flock owners, which might not be relevant for this audience, but still I wanted to mention that. Beginning farmer resources, YouTube videos, bird flu communication from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So it's kind of this curated list. Sometimes, when you look at a website, you're kind of going down these rabbit holes. And I like Linktree in the sense that it gives maybe a little more, everything kind of is kind of in front and center at a curated list. Also, I know this is not for backyard chickens, but there's obviously some similarities between backyard and commercial birds. Chickens are chickens. And I did want to highlight that UC A&R has been extremely patient over the last decade, and that a colleague of mine, Dr. Evan Adler, and myself, and this wonderful cartoonist, Will, who's in A&R, recently retired, we have a backyard chicken book that's coming out. And what makes this book different than maybe other backyardy kind of type books is a couple things. First of all, there's kind of these characters, and it's a little silly and goofy. You'll see my sophisticated dad sense of humor in here. But perhaps most importantly, it's peer-reviewed. So everything we wrote about diseases and behavior and nutrition and meat processing and euthanasia, it's not just my opinion. It's kind of the, kind of what the best science suggests. It's written in kind of hopefully a digestible way, and that's kind of, meant to kind of help newbies, but also, I think people that are experienced. So work with vet students, obviously being at the vet school, and we just don't teach a lot of poultry. So I'm hoping we can use this for curriculum for 4-H and for farmers, and just for fun for people that are passionate about chickens, and that have a sophisticated sense of humor like myself. That was a joke. Other resources I wanted to mention that are kind of in the process. So our lab does some stuff with apps and mobile apps. One of the things we're really working on in California is working with our county partners to have a tool. So apps are nice in that they can work when the internet is down. So what we are trying to do is create kind of an app that people can download, and they can have calculators for go bag checklists that you can have prepped beforehand, or at least get a sense of how much water and feed and all the other things you need to kind of have prepped in case there's a disaster, fires, floods, etc. Feed and water calculators. This searchable evacuation center is kind of one of the challenges we're trying to kind of work through, and that we are trying to work with our county partners on where the kind of disaster relocation centers are for dropping off animals, picking up animals, those kind of things. So hoping to have this at the latest by this fall. But it's been a little of a challenge, and we actually do have a small grant that has taken this kind of concept, and we're trying to build it out into Oregon and Hawaii, because there's been some disasters there among other places. And then eventually what we want to do is basically just have that app package, and that app package goes to any state in the U.S. So first starting in California, and then expanding from there in a perfect world. I am a veterinarian and an epidemiologist. So I sometimes I put this at kind of at the end of my slides, and I know not all of us like data and all those things, and not all of us like computers. But I did want to kind of highlight one thing. Whether it's on a piece of paper, in a little kind of notebook, or whether it's on a Google Sheet, it is really important to keep some kind of level of baseline data. Whether it could just be like things like egg production, feed consumption, just your own observations. But one of the challenges I have is when people call me, and they're asking questions. They're like, "Well, my egg production's down," and I go, "Okay, well, what is it? What was it? What was it before?" And invariably, a lot of people just don't know. So I think it's just really important that moving forward, that people move towards some version of this. It doesn't have to be fancy, but we just need to start thinking about where we got our birds from, how much food and water they're consuming, where we saw predators, because a lot of those things are related. Sometimes you have a drop in egg production because there's been predators in the area, and if you don't kind of capture that in some form, written or digital, it can be hard to make those connect the dots that way. We do have a site here where we've got kind of a version of this that you can kind of start with and decide which of those columns you want to work with, and how to use Google Sheets in case you don't know. So I wanted to start off with just some basic husbandry, and since this is for small farms, I wanted to focus a little on kind of these small farm setups that we've seen in California, and kind of focus on that area. So this is just a farm. I think this picture kind of captures a lot of things. It captures these kind of mobile coops, and I'll show you what the inside of that looks like in a minute. These are pretty big, so they need like a tractor or some kind of truck to kind of move them. So that's a challenge. You can see during the day, the birds can kind of go out and mingle, or go inside where there's lay boxes for them to drop off their eggs every morning, hopefully. And then this opens. Usually you can have automatic doors, which are solar powered and things like that, which can be on a timer. And then I wanted to highlight a couple other things here. So these fences here, they are electrified. It's not going to like electrocute anyone, but it's kind of designed in a perfect world to keep the birds in, and hopefully to keep predators out. But these are not perfect, and especially in a world where we're dealing with avian influenza, anywhere you see waterfowl, if those waterfowl are flying over ducks and geese, they can, drop off feces. If they see feed, and this is one of the more common scenarios, if they see feed that's spilled over here somewhere, they will eat that feed, and that's one of the ways they can transmit disease. So these fences are great. It's kind of a first line of defense, but it doesn't cover, the kind of the entire coop area, which is impossible for the most part for this kind of size flock. The other thing I want to mention is, and I don't know a lot about this, but most of these farms have some equivalent of a guard dog to help against coyotes and foxes and things like that. So there are resources for which dogs are good and breeds are good, and breeders are well versed in that aspect of it. But we call it Swiss cheese biosecurity, and the reason we call it Swiss cheese is because by itself this fence wouldn't be great. By itself the dog wouldn't be great. By itself, these coops wouldn't be great for various reasons we'll talk about, especially the bottoms of these, which I'll talk about in a second. But altogether, if we line up all those slices of Swiss cheese, we get a better, kind of level of protection. So this is the inside of that coop that you just saw. So this is this kind of wire mesh. And there's advantages and disadvantages to these wires. The disadvantages, at this size, mice can get in. This was kind of off the ground a little. I wasn't as concerned about that. The nice part about when they're inside and it's wire mesh, they can kind of fertigate the land. So there's an advantage to that. You can see some of these perches here. So the disadvantage of these perches, they should be rounded in a perfect world. Each bird, there should be a total of approximately 10 inches per bird for perch space. And here you can see some of those nest boxes. These should be ideally 12 by 12 by 12. And there should be, these are kind of wire on the bottom, but in a perfect world, you'd have some straw or even just like a piece of astroturf just to make sure the eggs aren't breaking or anything like that. And then some people will be very clever, and you can actually collect the eggs on the other side. You can have kind of a little latch, so you don't have to go in all these coops every single morning, because that's physically a pain. I can tell you. So here's some other mobile coops. These tarps are really important. We want, birds don't really like wind very much, but we need ventilation. So the tarps can kind of help us kind of control wind and ventilation. Someone have a question or? Okay. So I wanted to kind of highlight the tarps, but I'll show you how we have a tarp pulley system that we actually have some instructions on our website, and that's a great way to control kind of air quality. If you smell ammonia in these coops, either you don't have enough substrate, enough like rice hulls on the ground for the birds to kind of poop in, or your bird density is off, or you don't have good ventilation. That ammonia is not just bad for us; it's also bad for the birds. So it'll actually cause corneal ulcers in the birds. So just something to be aware of when it comes to ventilation, which is fundamental for animal health. So this is that UC Davis kind of pastured poultry coop that we built several years ago.
It's my conference that I'm attending.
Oh, can someone turn off their audio if they're not asking a question? So here you can see that we kind of collect these eggs on the back, and on the inside you've got those nest boxes. You usually want to have one nest box for every 5 laying hens that you have. That being said, I usually recommend you have at least 2 nest boxes no matter how many birds you have, just to give the birds some choices, and it seems to be a little better on the behavior side. We put a solar panel up here. This is our water. Water is a really challenging thing. So we have a little trough here that's fed, gravity fed from this kind of reservoir here. And then we kept some ladders and things like that. But you can kind of sort of see kind of these things actually here are really easy to make with PVC pipes, really inexpensive. And we put on top of that, we have kind of a mesh cloth, and the birds can actually. Oh,
that's really awesome.
can someone not turn off their audio, please, unless they have a question? But these are really important because we can get the birds, that you can see they kind of all huddle underneath the coop. So getting these out and about are really good because now the birds aren't as afraid of raptors. And we can put some feed in there, and now they can kind of munch the grass a little, find some worms and insects. Munching the grass, they don't really get calories out of, but there's value in it as long as we don't take that to an illogical conclusion. Because a laying hen will typically eat about a half a cup of feed a day. So if they're filling up on grass, then they're not getting their feed. If they're not getting their feed, they're not getting enough calcium, and that's when you get thin-shelled eggs and nutritional problems. So here's another coop design that we made. This is kind of our second generation coop. So our first generation coop, we learned okay, that's really big. It works great if you have a tractor or a 4x4. But we wanted to kind of make something lighter. We actually built this, and Davis have some really clever engineering students that I love working with. And we did a trial with black soldier fly larvae. And black soldier fly larvae are this great source of protein, advantages and disadvantages. It's really interesting when I do some work in East Africa. They are so far ahead of us when it comes to this because they don't really have the amount of soybeans that we do. Soybeans are more expensive than here. So black soldier fly larvae, first of all, it's part of the natural biology of birds to eat insects. And second of all, it offers a source of protein that is highly scalable, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for that in the next couple of decades, especially as we have about 2 billion more mouths to feed. If we can displace soybeans with black soldier fly larvae and other insects, that's a great way for to grow food animals without requiring more soybeans, for example, to be grown. This system had some advantages and disadvantages. Anyone that's ever worked with hardware cloth, this stuff is brutal, man. I look at this and I shudder a little because it'll scratch you. So it was very light, the structure. It can be moved really easily, but it was a little too, I think we took a good idea and made it a little too light, and we didn't put doors and things on these things. So getting in there to those nest boxes ergonomically was a little challenging. But yeah, this is how you learn, obviously. And I'm sure there's a lot of iterations of these type of things out there. But this is kind of another version of what we made. We brought this over to, we did some work with some farmers in California, but also did some work in Nepal with some of their farmers on a very small grant. But here you can see, instead of having to lug these things, which is totally possible, they weren't too heavy, we put wheels on it, which helped. But you can see these nest boxes, and there's a little piece of astroturf in there. And this system, I think actually this is probably, in my opinion, the best one that we made. We did do some work recently with some colleagues at Iowa State and University of Kentucky on integrative pasture poultry farming. So took a little drone, took some pictures here. Here you can see these are just these little broiler kind of coops that we built. There's little wheels here, and you can lift up over here, and it's almost like it's like a little like a wheelbarrow that you're moving. And this is some cover crop that we grew, and we used different rotations. This is out in Davis. So in Davis, I'll show you in a minute the rotation that we use between cover crops, tomatoes, butternut squash, and then rotating poultry around and around, with the idea of, like, can we create a system where the poultry fertigate, the broilers fertigate the land, and then we grow a cover crop to get rid of any salmonella kind of issues, and or create more nitrogen in the ground, and then rotate with a crop on top of that. So we did some work on that. Here you can kind of sort of see in a little more detail how these work. These are a pain to move, but doable. People that work on farms are tough, obviously, and they can do this stuff every day. Not only farmers tough, but they're creative. So people figure out over time what are the better ways to do these type of things. We talk to a lot of farmers and get some ideas from them. But as I said at the beginning, if you're on a farm every day, you'll figure stuff out. This is just the rotation we used in Davis, which is a little different than the rotation in Iowa and Kentucky. But we're in February or so you can see in the different systems that we explored, in February we were always on this kind of cover crop. The economics of that might not be 100% feasible, so it might require some winter crops, which we didn't explore. We actually have a paper coming out on the economics of these systems, which is fundamental to whether the system works or not. That's part of the equation, but the economics is ultimately, no one's going to adopt these if they don't work. But you can see the different kind of systems that we approach, and you could put in different chickens in here. The problem with when you put chickens on and then plant a cover crop is that there are some rules about how many days you have to wait before you harvest the crop and plant the crop, I believe, and those are in some of the national organic kind of standards. And Alda Perez at UC Davis is a great resource on that, and has done a lot of work on these kind of 120 to 180 day kind of periods of you can't harvest any kind of plant material until you've kind of waited that period of time. That period of time is not a magic number per se, but those are kind of the regulations. So I bet I can introduce you to Alda if you send me an email or answer questions if you can't track things down. Did want to talk just a little about food and water. Spilled feed, from a veterinary perspective, is probably the number one way that we get wildlife, which can spread disease, can be predators, into barns and into coops. So it is so important, whatever feeder system you use. I really like these treadle systems, but whatever feeders where you step on this little thing here and then you can get in there, nothing's perfect. But it is so important, whatever feeder system they use, that you have a human there making sure that they're cleaning things up, whether it's pellets or crumble or mash. I really like pellets. They're a little more expensive, but they're a little easier to clean up too. The other thing is waterers. So there's a lot of different types of watering systems out there. They all have challenges. These nipple systems are great, but they have a tendency to leak. They're hard to clean out, and they get biofilms in them. These bell waters are great, but they can spill a little more. Birds poop in them. One thing I've noticed for chicks is that, when you go on to, some of the larger facilities, when they're brooding the chicks, first of all, birds don't eat unless they're drinking about twice as much water as they're eating. So if I want my birds to get fat, so they're ready for harvesting, or I want them to get fat so they're sexually mature and they're producing eggs, I need to make sure they get enough water. So if they don't get enough water, they're not going to get enough food. If they don't get enough food, they're not going to be sexually mature to make eggs. So making sure they have access to water is really important. And chicks aren't always the smartest of birds. They're just learning the world. So putting shiny marbles in the waters does two things. It prevents them from drowning. Sometimes they'll drown in the waters. And two, it's shiny, so it kind of attracts them and they'll go to the waters. So feed and water, fundamental. And feed, water, and air. Those are the kind of basic things. I did talk a little about these shade structures, which are to me, like, super easy to make, super easy to move. You can kind of move them every day. You can put a little feeder under there to get them out there. They don't like just a feeder just by itself, because they are smart and in their kind of reptilian brain, and they don't want raptors that are circling above to pick them off. So this kind of gives them a little kind of protection. It's also important in a perfect world to have a quarantine pen. So if you have a flock of 10, 100 birds, 5 birds, if you notice coughing and sneezing, most likely the disease is spreading throughout the entire flock, but that doesn't mean you can't try to put birds that are sick in a separate pen with the idea of trying to protect the rest of your flock. So not a lot of people have a quarantine pen. I think it's a really important idea to have and to put those birds kind of separate. There are challenges with it. Like, how do those birds ever truly get better and not shed disease? That can be an issue. But I think it's important to at least try, because if we're dealing with some diseases that might move a little slower, it at least gives us a fighting chance to protect the birds in the flock. A few things I kind of wanted to mention here. So these kind of alternative small farm systems have a lot of challenges. And here's just a couple publications we did with some surveys and things like that. So when it comes to kind of operational kind of challenges, the biggest issue that you can see from the survey was feed cost. And feed is 70% of the operating cost, as many of you know, of raising a flock. And unless you're one of the really big poultry producers, you don't really get economy of scale discounts on feed. So you sometimes have to work with just buying feed from kind of feed stores. And the most expensive part of feed is protein. And when protein costs are high, that ultimately you want to really dial in how much protein you're feeding a bird. So if you look at like the large conventional commercial layer and broiler facilities, they'll have 3 to 5 different rations throughout the life cycle of the birds. And really what they're trying to do is use the minimum amount of protein required for 2 reasons. One is economic. If you're eating too much protein, you just basically poop it out. So now you're wasting money. And the other reason, I think, from just a broader perspective, is environmental. We don't want to basically spill protein into the environment because of eutrophication issues and things like that. So feed cost is we'll talk about that just very briefly in a few minutes. But feed costs are ultimately a big challenge, and I think there's good opportunities to lower this eventually, but the economic models for it are somewhat challenging. The other big issue is these kind of lack of processing facilities. So there are these, for those of you that do broilers, there are these mobile processing units. And there's some locations in California that we've worked with in the past that are not mobile, but they will help you, process birds for a fee. But that all goes, kind of off the top. And there are, some pretty, I would describe them as progressive rules in California as far as processing for small farms and kind of having it as a kind of family kind of affair. There's a lot of flexibility with respect to those things. So learning processing is probably a good thing, in part just because of logistics and cost. Regulations are challenging. I'm not a regulatory vet, but that's a big issue. When it comes to mortality, the biggest issue is predation. And these systems, I think, as you can kind of sort of see here, even with all these little things built in, birds will get picked off primarily by raptors. But I mean, if you get one raccoon that sneaks into this coop at night, raccoons are just mean, and they'll literally kill everything and just eat one bird. This kind of mortality issue can be a problem, including the other thing I want to mention is cannibalism. So if birds don't get enough protein, for example, or they're not getting the right amino acids, for example, the 2 amino acids, which are these kind of building blocks of protein, methionine and lysine. If they don't get enough methionine and lysine, that can actually lead to feather pecking, which can lead to kind of bleeding and cannibalism type activity. So just really important, when we think about raising a bird, our chicks and our broilers and our layers, it's really important to kind of think holistically. So how do chickens get sick? So I'm a veterinarian. This is kind of sort of the stuff I focus on. So insects and wildlife. There's one farm I was on a couple years ago, and the guy had his dead bird pile right next to his coop. So that's not good, because those dead birds are obviously drawing insects. Maybe those dead birds died because of an infectious disease, etc. So controlling insect and wildlife as best as possible. I'm a big fan of not making perfect the enemy of good. So what that means is do the best you can, but having your dead bird pile right next to your live bird is not a good idea. Diseases can get in through the environment, water and air. One of the problems we're dealing with avian influenza is you have these watersheds where diseases can move in the water, and also aerosols. You have all these farms that are packed really close to each other, which is probably not an ideal situation. And now you have feather dander, for example, that can be blown from one facility to another. We had about an outbreak last year in Ohio where about 80 farms broke with high path AI, and one of the explanations is that the majority of those farms, basically the virus was spread by feather dander. Feed. So unfortunately, rodents not only steal your food, but they will poop in the feeders. That spilled feed issue, really fundamental. Hatcheries. So this is unfortunately just the way life works. Sometimes you do everything right, but you get your birds from a hatchery, and those birds have a disease. So one of the things we worry about, especially with chicks, is that they might come contaminated with Salmonella enteritidis, among other diseases. So a lot of farmers, as I'll mention in a few minutes, a lot of farmers will have they'll buy their chicks, and then they'll keep the chick papers, basically the paper kind of that the birds are mailed in or traveled in, and then they'll submit those to a diagnostic lab to look for Salmonella enteritidis, because if they have that bacteria, they want to know, did that come from the hatchery or did that come from my farm? So I'll show some data on that briefly in a minute. The litter, if we don't manage the litter right, usually in California we use rice hulls, which are wonderful. They're absorbable. As far as like ammonia, the birds like to kind of rototill it, so they kind of compost it. But if we don't manage that litter correctly, infectious diseases can build up in there. And then when we put our next flock in, we definitely need to make sure that we at least take that top layer of litter off, and then windrow or compost what's going on below it. That's its own talk, but there's a whole kind of husbandry type of aspect to that. Fomite, so that's just a fancy way of saying, if I borrow a shovel or equipment from my neighbor who has birds, and then I bring that to my site, if I haven't disinfected that equipment, now I'm bringing diseases. So humans, because of how we ping around the world so quickly, or in our neighborhoods, we are huge fomite carriers on our shoes, our hands, our clothing. So when you go to the feed store, for example, never wear the same stuff that you would wear in your coop. And I think we all intuitively know that, but sometimes easier to say things than to do things. And then workers kind of as part of that fomite thing. We need to make sure our workers are trained, are fastidious. I think sometimes there was an interesting poster I saw at a meeting several years ago where it basically suggested that breaches in biosecurity, it's more of a behavioral issue than a knowledge issue. So are you a fastidious person? Some of us are, some of us are not. So if you're fastidious, you'll do the right thing with the education. But if you have the education and you're not fastidious, you'll kind of cut corners a little. And I'm probably on that, unfortunately, in that second area. And then in eggs, just to kind of briefly say, so Salmonella enteritidis, the most common source of Salmonella that affects us humans. Birds can be carriers of Salmonella enteritidis, but for the most part don't get sick or die. So unfortunately, when people say, oh, I know my birds don't have Salmonella, and you go, why? And they're like, well, because they're not sick. That doesn't unfortunately hold true. But just to point out that Salmonella can be transferred vertically from an infected hen to its hatching egg or table egg, or it can be transmitted horizontally where the poop, basically the eggs are porous and the poop gets in the egg. CDC estimates that about 1 out of every 10,000 eggs have Salmonella enteritidis. If you are commercially selling eggs, there are rules on when you need to test for Salmonella enteritidis if your flock is above 3,000. But there's, in my mind, and if you talk to a lot of stores, they don't particularly care whether you have 999 or 30,000. They want you to test. So I encourage people to follow the test. There are vaccines which have some efficacy, but we don't require them. But kind of testing is one way to kind of maybe make people feel, especially customers, feel confident. That being said, if you cook your eggs to 165, your Salmonella problem, even if there is a problem, is not an issue. And one of the ways that we can deal with Salmonella for the large commercial folks is they can sell contaminated eggs to a processing facility that makes egg powder. These breaker facilities, and those go ultimately to like pancake mixes and things like that. Farmers hate doing that because it's kind of a pennies on the dollar type of return on investment there. This is just to show you, that we all live, whether we like it or not, we all live in the same environment and habitat. And you might say, I never interact with with fighting birds or backyard birds at all. But the reality is that a lot of us share these same environments. So it's important that we acknowledge that and we do the best. If I'm going to a feed store, I better wear some different shoes because I am interacting with all these other people at the feed store, whether I realize it or not. So how do we protect our flocks? Lots of different ways. Again, Swiss cheese, biosecurity, don't make perfect the enemy of good. Obtain your chicks from reputable sources. So there is this thing called, I'm blanking on the name right now. Wow, I'm totally blanking on that. I'll tell you in a minute. NPIP, National Poultry Improvement Plan. So in a perfect world, you would get your chicks from hatcheries or feed stores that get their chicks from hatcheries that are part of NPIP, National Poultry Improvement Plan, because they do some kind of surveillance for diseases. They have to kind of be inspected. So there is kind of a general sense that they are running their operation, reputably. It can be challenging for some folks. Like if you, work with a small hatchery, there are costs associated with being part of NPIP. That it doesn't mean that if someone is not part of NPIP that they're bad. It just means that they're at least meeting certain criteria. So all things being equal, make sure your chicks are from NPIP, but it doesn't mean that I would say that if they're not part of NPIP that you shouldn't work with them. So Marek's disease vaccine is fundamental. The number one killer of backyard birds is Marek's disease. Someone's asking about washing before I go down to biosecurity. Someone's asking about washing fertilized eggs before putting them into the incubator. I think there is some there is some literature that says you should wash your eggs. But I think I don't think most people do. I'm not an expert on that, so if you send me an email on that, I can kind of summarize and kind of look at the literature a little more, and I can actually even talk to one of the very large broiler veterinarians in our state that does a lot of work with their hatchers. sometimes you troubleshoot things. So if you do have problems in your incubators, then you start thinking about like, hey, what are we not doing? Fertilized eggs, any eggs that have dirt on them, probably want to start, kind of thinking about why did they get dirt on them, and maybe we should be disinfecting the eggs. I don't think most people do disinfect the eggs before they put them in their incubators, but I have seen some papers that show that is somewhat efficacious. So that was kind of a non-answer, but feel free to reach out if you want me to reach out to some of the veterinarians I know that might know a little more on that. So Marek's disease vaccine, fundamental, number one killer of backyard birds in California and beyond. Unfortunately, that vaccine only works if you give it at day 1 of age or if it gets in ovo while the embryo is still developing. So that's why you need to work with your hatcheries to make sure that they're vaccinating against Marek's disease. Most, if not all, commercial, conventional farms are vaccinating against Marek's disease in layers and in broilers because it's just such a ubiquitous virus, and it's 99.9% preventable. So I would encourage people, if you're going to do any vaccine, it would be the Marek's disease vaccine. And we have a YouTube video, which I'll show, I'll make the point in a second where it lives. But you can work with you can do this yourself. It's 100% doable, and you can buy these bottles of 500 vaccines of Marek's. They're only like $20 or $30, so even if you use 10 of them, it's not the end of the world. If you can get a vet bill under $30, my God, that's a win-win-win. So, don't allow your chickens in your home. This is kind of more of a backyardy thing, but I think it's important to realize that. Avoid commingling. So if you've got 2 flocks, one older and one younger, the younger flock could be exposed to diseases from the older flock, or vice versa, but usually older birds, have more chances to get exposed. So that commingling now is a real challenge. Sometimes that's not avoidable, and you just have to be aware that that's a risk. So don't have more chickens than you can handle. So from a husbandry perspective, when you look at some of these, I'm not going to get all the way back there, but when you look at some of those coops, the math only works out if those birds are able to get out every day. But when you have diseases and things like that, where the state vet is telling you need to keep your birds indoors in a perfect world, now you're dealing with welfare issues if your birds don't have at least, kind of 2 square feet per bird. So I've seen a lot of situations where these kind of mobile coops are great, as long as those birds can get out every day and go on to these nice pastures. Like you're like, wow, this is it's like a Norman Rockwell picture. But when the birds are kind of cooped inside that coop for longer than a day or 2 or 3 or 4, the math doesn't really pencil out, and you're dealing with potentially a welfare problem. Use clothes. We talked about this earlier. Wash your hands. It's all the easy things we know. When you introduce new birds, it's important to quarantine them just to make sure that you're not bringing new diseases onto your farm. Separate sick birds from healthy birds, and rotating your coop in one form or fashion is a good way to kind of let the land kind of recover, let UV sunlight kind of disinfect the land before you move birds back into that area. Foot baths. So foot baths are good and bad. If you change your disinfectant every single day, foot baths are great. If you actually put your boots when you're walking to your barn in the foot bath and you scrub them, they're great. But I've been on enough farms where you look at the foot bath and you're like, okay, that disinfectant hasn't been changed in a week, so it's basically useless. And you also see people like race through the foot bath because we're all busy. So foot baths are good if they're used properly to disinfect your shoes. But if you don't use them correctly, then I would just be meticulous in other ways, because sometimes the people that they think that if they just tiptoe through it really quickly, they'll somehow magically be fine. Be aware of wildlife. So, I think we all know, these are some geese here that are on some vetch that we recently planted on this field here. So they'll just eat all the seeds, and if our barn is, literally, right over here, a couple hundred or a few meters away, now we've just created habitat for geese and for ducks and other wildlife to spread disease. So easier said than done. There can be feces within that kind of coopy area. Again, all these things are easier said than done, and there's ways that we can manage and mitigate that potential for spillover of disease from wildlife to our domestic farm animals. But it's challenging. Okay, so even under the best case scenarios, we have challenges, and these systems, that's their kind of Achilles heel is how do we make these systems, because consumers want eggs and meat from these kind of systems, so we need to do our best to optimize and reduce the potential for spillover disease onto those systems. So a few diseases I'm going to talk about just very briefly. So if you look at just kind of all these submissions to our CAFS diagnostic lab with respect to just backyard birds, which has some crossover to kind of these small and medium farms on the poultry world. The big killers are viral diseases, bacterial diseases, and parasitic diseases. And very briefly talk about them since we only have about 10 minutes or so. So Marek's disease, the big killer, right? So if I was going to talk about one disease that's preventable all the way across the board, I would talk about Marek's disease because it's causes a lot of mortality. B, it's preventable if we can vaccinate and make sure we're addressing any feather dander that's in our brooder or in our barn, because the virus, that Marek's disease virus, is a herpes virus, is very persistent. So we need to make sure, even if we vaccinate, or even if we don't vaccinate, we need to make sure we get rid of all the feather dander, because the virus is ubiquitous in the environment, and it kind of concentrates in these feather follicles and feather dander. So if we vaccinate and then we put the birds in a coop with a bunch of feather dander, they're probably still going to become very susceptible to tons of virus in there. Vaccine is not like this magic force field, as I think we all intuitively know now. It works. It helps prevent disease, but if we are in an environment with tons of COVID, vaccine or no vaccine, we're putting ourselves in a risky environment. Same thing with things like Marek's disease. So just a couple things. It's very common. It's immunosuppressive. The biggest thing you see, the most kind of classic sign you'll see is these birds that are not moving at all, because it'll actually cause tumors in their sciatic nerve. And I'll sometimes get this, people will tell me like, oh, my bird's not hungry. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not hungry? It's like, well, it's not going to the feeder. And I'm like, well, is it not going to the feeder because it's basically paralyzed, or is it not going because it's hungry? And we kind of can work down to this kind of diagnosis sometimes. So vaccination actually works great. In the commercial conventional world, they have this in novo vaccine, which is cell associated, which these vaccines, it's not that they work better, but if you can give the vaccine a few days before the embryo hatches, the egg hatches, it actually works a little better because their immune system gets a little kind of boost even before being exposed inevitably to Marek's disease. But in a non-perfect world, these sub-Q vaccines, which can be given very easily, which I'll show you the link for the video, they're very easy to give, and they can be given a day of age. The dogma is if you don't give it a day of age, it's not going to work because the virus is so ubiquitous. So sometimes people say, oh, should I give them a boost at a week or a year? And I'm like, you can do whatever you want, but the science says that that's not, kind of efficacious in any way. So you just need that one vaccine on day 1 of age. And here's like a little video. If you look on our UCD Petoskey lab on YouTube, we've got a nice little 4-minute video on how to vaccinate these birds. And then you can buy this vaccine. Sometimes I go to feed stores and they won't have it. Some will. We live in a world of Amazon, so you can usually buy these things. But watch the video, ask questions. It is easy to give, but you can work with your veterinarian too if that's an issue. Regardless of vaccination, so just make sure that you get, the biggest thing I want to point out here is get rid of that feather dander. So whether you vaccinate or don't vaccinate, those feathers that are kind of distributed throughout your coop or your brooder, they will have a lot of virus kind of localized in there. So we want to reduce that. Vaccines are complicated. So Marek's, I recommend in all cases. Coccidia and infectious bronchitis, we don't usually use those. Coccidia, we have Coccidia stats, which are medicated feed. Coccidia causes diarrhea. Some people don't like using Coccidia stats because they want organic. So if you're organic, you can't use Coccidia stats. You can use the vaccine. There are some feed stores now that have the vaccine. Don't use both. So if you use the vaccine, that's live Coccidia that's going into the bird, and then the Coccidia stat would kill the vaccine. So don't do that. But one or the other. The Coccidia stat is not an antibiotic in the way that you and I refer to antibiotics. So we don't have to worry about resistance in humans because we don't have protozoal parasites. We're not exposed to them, so we don't have to worry about that aspect of it. But it is something. It's very common. So Marek's and Coccidia are very common, and Coccidia is kind of interesting because the research now suggests you want like a little keep the environment nice and clean, and you'll have just enough Coccidia to kind of self-immunize. But when you have spillage of water and feed, and the Coccidia protozoal parasite in its life cycle can basically start circling around in your coop. So definitely with water and density and poop, good idea to kind of that's where husbandry comes in. But those Coccidia stats are great. But I know for if you have a commercial, if you're organic or you're marketing your eggs and meat a certain way, then the Coccidia stats are not viable. Newcastle disease, if we're in a Newcastle zone, kind of Southern California, this is a big issue. So I can talk to folks about that separately. Dry pox, very common. And I'll briefly mention that in a couple minutes because I only have about 5 minutes left. Salmonella enteritidis, this is a food safety issue. The vaccine's not great, but it is solid. I would recommend people do surveillance and test for Salmonella enteritidis as opposed to vaccinating for it if you had to decide one or the other. And we don't use high path AI in the United States for various reasons yet. We do vaccinate condors now because condor population has been, unfortunately, in California has been affected. And infectious laryngotracheitis, this is kind of an interesting one. Just very briefly, in the sense that the live vaccine can actually revert to virulence. So you have these layer facilities that'll vaccinate, and then you have a broiler facility downwind. And if they vaccinate as an aerosol, the vaccine eventually can revert to virulence. It can kind of mutate, and now it can cause ILT, infectious laryngotracheitis, in those broiler facilities. And that's been a drama in California, among other places.
Maurice,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Just a quick note is we do have until 9:15 with
Oh.
this meeting. So,
Okay.
if you want faster, we can take more time for questions.
Okay, so let's go. We have about. I'll go for 10 minutes, and then I'll go for 5 more minutes, and then we'll take some questions. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me, yeah. It's up to you.
Okay. So those are the vaccines. This is a dry pox this is what dry pox looks like. This is my favorite avian disease because normally like people will call me or text me and send me pictures of poop or their chicken that looks a little weird. And I'll be like, I have no clue what that is. You need to send that to a diagnostic lab. We have a CAF system in California. We have 4 labs, which you can submit your birds in for, I think, nominal fee, $20, $25. They'll do all this amazing diagnostics with the goal of figuring out what's wrong with your birds so we can protect the rest of the flock. Sometimes it's a nutritional disease. Sometimes it's a reproductive disease. Sometimes it's an infectious disease. Dry pox I love because if someone sends me a picture like this, I'm like, dry pox. And then I feel like I'm actually helping someone as opposed to kind of telling them to go to the CAF's lab. So you'll see these little scabs here. It's not like a huge mortality disease, but you will see it. It will affect productivity. It's really ugly. These little virus things, if you decide to like pick them off or anything, there is gazillions of little virions in there. So when they shed this kind of these scabs in the environment, that's how the virus cycles. That being said, it's primarily spread by mosquitoes. Controlling for mosquitoes, there's a gazillion and one reasons we want to do that, but gazillion and two is we want to protect our birds. So prevention, it's spread by mosquitoes, so focus on mosquito control. The virus can cause disease in almost avian species, so wildlife can also carry it. So focus on biosecurity and good husbandry. Fully recovered birds do not appear to be carriers. That's a big deal because most of the viral and bacterial diseases, the problem is when they recover, they can still potentially be reservoirs of virus or bacteria. So that's a problem with our sick pen kind of concept that we talked about earlier. The vaccine, again, you can give also. We mix what's called the pigeon pox version of dry pox and the avian pox, so we get good coverage. And then we use this little 2-prong applicator, and we dip it in the vaccine kind of mixture, and then we kind of punch it through their wing web here. It's not hard to do, like everything. The first time it's always a little scary, but it's actually kind of satisfying because it's almost like a hole puncher type thing. You just go straight through, you get in the wing web, and then you're done. One piece of advice: just make sure you always pick the same wing. So because you want 7 to 10 days later, you want to look for that little take, and that's a good sign that they got not just vaccinated but immunized. So big difference when we vaccination's easy, like we tell students all the time. Immunization is hard. And if you don't do your vaccine correctly, that's when you don't get proper immunization. Or if you do, mix matching of different viruses and the ones that are in the field. So there is a kind of a chess match going on here, but making sure you give your vaccine correctly is fundamental to getting immunization. Eimeria or Coccidia, that's that other disease that was super, super, super common, only in chicks. So if you have young chicks that have diarrhea, this is a big issue. And they won't always die from Coccidia, but they'll just kind of be poor doers for the rest of their life because you kind of change their guts now are a little hemorrhagic and things like that. They don't eat as much, and your whole flock is just a little droopier now and not doing as well. So controlling for Eimeria, remember we talked about the vaccine that's potentially available. Better than that's the Coccidia stat, and most important overall is this good husbandry is kind of fundamental. But here you can see kind of what some of these guts look like from these different species of Eimeria or Coccidia. And unfortunately, if they get one of them, they're still susceptible to the other ones. So it's a really important disease to control for, in addition to Marek's. So a lot of diarrhea. Going to kind of move along here because I want to answer any questions that folks have. But the natural immunization is just really important. So if you have good litter management, when we talk about those rice holes and things like that, that seems to also be somewhat protective, almost like we're doing a natural immunization. But it's nice to have a little help on top of that. So I wanted to kind of move on. Okay, so I want to mention something about Salmonella enteritis because this is a food safety issue for humans and not so much for birds. It's rare. So I said 1 of every 10,000 eggs. Based on our reviews of the literature and some of the papers that we've written, maybe 2% of all flocks, but it's there enough and people get sick from it. That we need to think about. A lot of people like, runny egg sandwiches and things like that. So we need to be really thoughtful about how we try to protect our consumers and ourselves. And I just want to mention that there are different ways to test the environment for Salmonella enteritis. So we have on our website, we have a link for basically how to make these little clippy things with a pole on it, and then you just rub a gauze pad that's dipped in condensed milk, which is a good media for Salmonella, and you rub it all over the barn, and then you send them to the calf's lab. If you have over 3,000 hens, FDA has their rules that are required, and California has their voluntary rules that are required. I would say the most important sample, if you were going to pick one, do one a year in your coop, but do it if you have a young flock that hasn't yet started laying eggs. I would start early because what you don't want to do is find Salmonella enteritis and then be like, oh, well, if I know it's here, I'm not going to raise these birds, or I'm not going to use their eggs, or I'm just going to use it for my home consumption and just cook them. So all kinds of things we can talk about offline if people actually have a problem. I'm not going to talk too much about vaccination tidbits. I did want to kind of mention I love this cartoon here for a couple reasons. It just kind of reiterates the reality that there's just not a lot of treatments in poultry. That's not the way, in part because we have to worry about antibiotics and withdrawal times and residues in eggs and meat that we don't have a lot of treatment. So these Coccidia stats are pretty good at working on Coccidia. This hatchet obviously is, kind of the joke here. Sieve and dust is used to be good, or it's still good for dealing with ectoparasites, but there is a problem, and sieve and dust is actually not available in California anymore because of environmental rules from the EPA, I believe. So I think this is it's just important for us to realize prevention. We need to focus on prevention. Vaccines prevention, good husbandry prevention, good biosecurity prevention. Those are the things we need to focus on. And how do we kind of understand kind of our risk landscape is really by kind of getting a sense of what's outside our facility. So here we've got, a cat. Those cats obviously can carry all kinds of diseases. They're good at controlling rodents, and to their credit. But cats can also be predatory too. You see a rabbit over there. But the biggest thing that wild animals look for is feed. So we need to make sure that we're storing our feed properly. There's all kinds of clever feeders out there. These are these pelleted feeds, but ultimately we want to prevent this from happening. That's how diseases spread. And then you don't have to wear all this fancy equipment here, but just having something that you have dedicated to your coop is really important. And predators are challenging. So if anyone ever tells you like, oh, get this, laser or do this to control for predators, I promise you it will work maybe a little for a little, and then it won't work. Predators are smart, and walk your fence lines, because if you have gaps in your fence lines, predators will see that too, maybe before us. So there's all these different types of things, predator repellent tape, and all these other things which people will swear by on the internet. Be very skeptical. Nothing works perfectly. I promise you that. Whether it's lasers or even some of the pyrotechnics and things like that some of the farmers will use. If birds will move, they'll move a few hundred yards away and then they'll come back unless you continually apply pressure and unless there's alternative habitat further away. Predators are really hard to deal with. These decoys are great, but if you keep them in the same spot, the birds aren't, the predators are smart again. And fencing is kind of the one basic things. Dogs are great too. That's its own thing, which I'm not an expert in, but I know people are very passionate about that. And actually, dogs are probably one of the better options, but you just need to make sure the dogs don't eat the birds, right? So you need specially trained dogs for that. And the fencing is a good option. So I just want to mention one thing about feed, and then I'll turn it over for any questions. So this is that pelleted feed I was talking about. This is a crumble, and this is a mash. This is usually a little more expensive. You only want this for adult birds, but it's easier to clean up. So I recommend that. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about feed is calculate your feed conversion ratio. That's a very simple thing to capture, whether you do it weekly, daily, or over the entire flock. You ultimately want to feed is 70% or 75% of your operating costs. So total animal weight in for broilers as the denominator. For layers, it's the weight of the eggs you've collected, and the numerator is the total feed consumed, or the total feed consumed in a week or a month. But calculate that out. You want this number. You want your feed conversion ratio to be as low as possible. In the commercial world, in the layer world, we want it around 2. For pastured, it's definitely higher than that for various reasons, and for broilers, we can get it down to about 1.75. Tilapia, just as an FYI, has the lowest feed conversion ratio of all commercial birds, of all commercial food animals, and it's about 1. So with that, I'll take any questions you have. I've always go a little longer as far as the number of slides. So if people have questions, I can answer them now. So thank you for listening. Hopefully that was helpful.
All right. So thank you, Maurice. Amazing talk. And like he said, the room is open for questions if you have any other than the ones that you put in the chat, which I believe we've gotten to already. Mm-hmm. People are clapping, virtually clapping, echoing what I was saying. Oh, I'm curious why there is not more use of AI vaccine. Al?
Yeah. So that is a good. Yeah, I can see
Oh,
the chat box now. So there was a question on avian influenza vaccine. So long story short, there's trade restrictions when you start vaccinating against avian influenza because you can have asymptomatic spread. And the worry is that countries that vaccinate against avian influenza by their trade practices and their vaccination practices might accidentally be spreading virus around the world. That's of particular interest. So the turkey industry and the layer industry in the U.S. want vaccine because their consumers are internal and they've been heavily affected by avian influenza. The broiler producers, which are like the big guys in the room as far as the economics of it, and have the USDA's ear probably a little more. They don't want vaccination in general because they're afraid it'll affect trade. And you have to remember the United States is we send a lot of breeding populations around the world. So we're sending live birds to different locations. So the idea that we might spread disease is kind of the big issue. Vaccines are not easy to give also, so the logistics of it would be somewhat challenging, but there's a lot of pressure to vaccinate from layer states and from turkey states, and then there's a lot of pressure not to vaccinate from the broiler states. It is kind of amusing to me when you hear a senator talking and you can kind of tell what state they're from. It's not a party thing, a political party thing. You can tell what state they're from based upon whether they support or don't support vaccination for avian influenza. Okay, I'm looking at some other ones. My birds were sold to me as being vaccinated against Marek's, but I still have it in my flock. Yep. So again, so there are some like super virulent versions of Marek's floating around, which are kind of don't they don't interact with the vaccine properly because viruses, just because you vaccinate against Marek's doesn't mean that you've protected your flock against all the different versions of Marek's. Also doesn't mean that the vaccine was given correctly. So it does happen, but that's not horribly surprising in that it does happen. And ultimately, what you want to do is vaccinate against Marek's, get rid of that feather dander, and then cross your fingers. Right? That's all you can do. But yeah, sometimes you do all the right things, and the wrong outcome happens, and then other people don't do any of the right things, and everything seems to work perfectly for them. So that's unfortunately sometimes how life works. Sorry to hear about that. So someone is asking, is there a minimum number of hens they should start seriously considering vaccinations, wearing separate clothes? So the smallest flock that you should ever have is 3. So birds are very gregarious and social. So chickens are. So if they're by themselves, that's not a good husbandry behavior kind of way to raise a bird. If you have 2, you're just 1 away from 1, so that's really scary. So I always say 3 is the minimum. And for vaccinations, wearing separate clothes, if you have 3 birds, you should start thinking about that. You should 100% be doing that. Marek's doesn't distinguish on the size of the flock. And if you're kind of thinking about trying to protect your flock from disease, all those things that we talked about, whether it's 3 or 3 million, you should be doing. Is anyone else making their own wheat, flax, soy, corn free feed? Any thoughts on paste-like feed versus the dry feed? So the soy-free one, and I'm not a nutritionist. So when you the part about soy-free, so nutritionists hate soy-free because it's just hard to do apparently to balance everything out. But the problem with soy-free, at least from my mind, and I've talked to nutritionists about this, is that if I have a soy allergy, if I give my chickens soy, they break down that soy into its amino acids before it goes into the egg. So a soy-free diet doesn't mean anything about soy allergies unless somehow the feed ends up on the egg, on the outside of the egg. The paste-like feeds versus the dry feeds, so some people do stuff with fermented feeds. The only problem with that is just the logistics of that. It can be a little challenging. Whether it's a little more digestible or not, I think that's one of the potential advantages, but I'm certainly not an expert in that. The corn-free corn is energy and soy is protein. There are other sources of corn and of energy and protein. So sometimes it just comes down to cost, and those fermented feeds, have that potential advantage of maybe being a little more digestible, but they're also it's a little more time consuming, and in theory, maybe there's a little more risk of some bacterial contamination if not done correctly.
All right. It does look like we need to start wrapping here. So again, thank you so much, Maurice, for participating. To everyone who participated, there's Maurice already shared his contact information. So you can reach out to him. As I said in the beginning, we are going to share the recording later on. So yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Maurice?
No, that the vaccine one comes up a lot. First of all, thanks for everyone's questions and good thoughts here. So the Marek's vaccine, it would be great if you can get like a little 10 vial dose or something like that. But apparently the companies, for some reason, if you were going to come up with a vial of 10 versus 500, they have to go through this whole regulatory kind of thing again, and it just doesn't pencil out for them. So unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with those 500 dose ones as the small ones. So, yeah, no, I certainly appreciate that, but that's it. Sorry.
All right.
Anyway, thanks. I know you guys got to go. So.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating. We have many more workshops coming, so stay tuned. See you.